Okay, for our final session of the day, I'm really excited to welcome Barbara F. Walter. She is an international studies professor at the University of California, San Diego. She is also the author of How Civil Wars Start and How to Stop Them, which came out last year and is obviously very topical with everything that we've been discussing the past few months. And she even well before January 6th, well before 2016, she was already covering political violence. So this is an area where she has really deep research. So with that, please join me in welcoming Barbara.
Thank you very much. It's really tremendous to be here. I thought I'd take my time just to give you a brief, I'll tell you a little story about how I came to write this book and why I think it resonated so well with the public, which I really actually didn't expect that it would. I have spent the last 30 years studying civil wars around the globe. I'm sitting here in my office at UC San Diego right now. I spent most of my time alone with my laptop doing mostly quantitative, but some qualitative research. And then in 2017, I was invited to become a member of a task force run by the CIA. It's called the Political Instability Task Force. It's been around since 1994, and I served on it until the end of 2021. The task force really had a series of goals, but the biggest goal and the reason why I was invited to join was that the task force had a predictive model that helped the U.S. government predict where around the world political instability, political violence, and civil war was likely to break out. And they developed this model in conjunction with experts like me. So 4 times a year, I would go to suburban Virginia. I'd sit in a conference room in a hotel. Half the room was academics like me. Half the room were data analysts. And the data analysts would ask us, tell us everything that you've learned from the academic literature. What's come out? What are the big studies? What are the big studies telling us? And when we initially did this, we basically told them that there were at least 38 different factors that all the different studies pointed to. So we really didn't know what was most important. We knew that a lot of things might be important in kind of pushing countries down the road towards violence, but we didn't know exactly which ones were most important. Well, the data analysts took these factors, and some of them seemed quite obvious: poverty, income inequality, how racially and ethnically diverse a country was, whether a country was big or small, very populated, not populated. And the analysts took all these factors and they played around with the model until they came up with the least amount of factors that best predicted the outbreak of violence. And it turns out that 2 were more important than everything else. And this actually came as a surprise to the experts. And it wasn't the factors that we thought would be important. So again, that was another surprise. The 2 most important factors were something that we call anocracy. Anocracy is just a fancy term for partial democracies. So these are countries that have weak democracies, failing democracies, or conversely, they're new democracies. They're desperately trying to move away from authoritarianism. So it turns out that full democracies rarely experience civil war. Full autocracies rarely experience civil war. Most of the civil war happens in this middle zone. So that was one of the 2 factors that was really important. The second factor was whether the citizens of these partial democracies had organized themselves politically around identity. So rather than having political parties that were based on particular ideas, so conservative principles versus liberal principles, they had political parties that were formed pretty much exclusively around race, ethnicity, or religion. So, if you want to think about an example, think about what happened in the former Yugoslavia after the fall of the Soviet Union. You had a country that was authoritarian. It didn't really have political parties, and it very quickly attempted to democratize. And the parties that formed during the early 1990s were not a communist party, a liberal party. They were a Serb party, a Croat party, a Bosnian party. And it didn't really matter if the members of that party disagreed on all sorts of political principles. All it mattered was that you were a Serb or a Croat or a Bosnian. That's sort of classic, what we call factionalism. And it's this combination of anocracy plus factionalism, which is this combustible mix. So every year, again, we would look at all the countries around the world. We would figure out which countries had these two features. If they had these two features, we put them on something we called the watch list. We sent the watch list to the White House. I have no idea what the White House did with it. But we never talked about the United States. The CIA is not allowed to study the United States. They're not allowed to focus on the United States in any way. And so we never ever talked about what was happening in this country. But I was a private citizen. I was watching what was happening, and I knew the data sets that we used. I knew the way that anocracy and factionalism was measured. And starting in 2016, I observed how these two factors were emerging here in the United States. They were actually emerging in a surprisingly rapid rate. And nobody knew about it. And of course, what we know in the task force is the best thing that you can do is to have some warning of what's ahead. We knew that countries that had these two features, every year that they had these two features, they were at a 4% risk of civil war. That seems low, but it's actually not low. It means that every year that those features continue to exist in a particular country, it goes up by 4%. So after 10 years, the risk of political violence and civil war is 40%. After 20 years, it's 80%. But what the model does is it gives you time. If you actually know what the factors are that put you at high risk of violence, it gives you time to turn the ship around. And so I started writing the book in 2018. It came out just in January of this year. And I think one of the reasons why it actually did as well as it did was that I didn't talk about the United States at all until chapter 6. The first 5 chapters were really just laying out all the evidence that scholars have collected over decades about the risk factors for civil war. It was laying out all the studies that have been done about the underlying conditions for civil war. It was talking about other countries, whether it was Northern Ireland or Ukraine or Syria or Iraq or the Philippines, and allowing the reader to come to his or her own conclusion about whether these same patterns were showing themselves here in the United States. And I think that ended up being quite powerful, was that I wasn't beating people over the head by saying, America is going down a bad path, we're in danger. All I did was say, here are the factors that we know put countries at higher risk of civil war. Here's what happened in the former Yugoslavia, in fairly minute detail. And what becomes quite terrifying as you read it was that there are so many similarities. And again, once you see those similarities, you can't unsee them. So I'll leave it at that. We can talk more about what I mean by civil war, what the task force means by civil war. We could talk about anything you want. So thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Kirk Beto with National Journal. Thank you so much for your time today. And I kind of do want to start with that question. Do we operate as civil war? What do you mean by civil war? What do the task force mean by civil war? And does that change at all?
Yeah.
Are there
So
different types of-
the data on civil wars, there's a number of different data sets. There's a big one at the University of Michigan, but the biggest one and the one that most people go to is housed at Uppsala University in Sweden. And it's been funded by the governments of Norway and Sweden and the World Bank and a whole series of nonprofits. And it's all publicly available. If you Google Uppsala or you Google armed conflict data set, you can have access to it in a matter of seconds. And they define civil wars as two types. There's major, and they call it armed conflict, major armed conflict, minor armed conflict. Major armed conflict is simply violence that's between one domestic group and the government that produces 1,000 battle deaths per year. Minor armed conflict is the same, but it just produces 25 battle deaths a year. The civil wars that we look at the task force are all at the major category or above. So we don't look at a lot of the little ones. And so it really is a fairly broad definition. But if you look actually out in the world, what this actually looks like, I think one of the big misconceptions that people have is that most civil wars look like our own Civil War, the American Civil War. And in fact, that was quite unusual in many, many ways. And it's an old style of civil war. It's an 1860s version of a civil war. A civil war like that almost never happens. It will never happen again in this country, where you have two large armies and uniforms meeting each other on a battlefield, the rebels engaging with government soldiers. Today, if you are trying to topple or you're trying to change the leadership of a country with a really powerful military like the United States, the last thing you want to do is actually engage soldiers. You're going to be crushed. And so the 21st century type of civil war that we see over and over again, think about the Philippines, in more powerful countries, think about what Israel experienced or what the UK experienced in Northern Ireland, is more guerrilla warfare and long periods of terror where the violence is directed at civilians, at opposition leaders, where you really don't see direct military engagement, mostly because the rebels consciously keep themselves small, decentralized, very difficult to root out. So that's the type of 21st century civil war that we talk about and that we worry about here and abroad.
Hi, my name is Ryan. I read your book and it's really eye-opening. And I was wondering if you might be able, it seems like the tone of the book takes the US is going down a bad path. There are a lot of warning signs going on, but it's not necessarily the future. And I guess my question was, what would be some of the signs that you would see to say, this is going to be inevitable, that, it's going to be very, very likely, what are some of those signs in your mind?
Yeah. So, again, the CIA has a manual on insurgency, and there's a 2012 version of it that's available on the internet, and some of it's redacted, but most of it is not. And I encourage anybody who's interested in this subject to Google it and to read it. It's not very long. Again, the U.S. government put this manual of insurgency together for exactly the reason that you just brought up. Like, how do we know something's happening? What are the warning signs? And it lays out 3 different phases of insurgency: the pre-insurgency phase, the incipient insurgency phase, and the active insurgency phase. And again, one of the really striking things about reading this is it's directed at foreign governments. It's written by analysts at the CIA who have experience and have been observing what's happened in other countries. It has nothing to do with the United States, and yet you see many of these warning signs. So the incipient phase is when you have a group that has grievances against the government. It's beginning to articulate those grievances. It's beginning to organize, create an organization that, often has a military arm, but it hasn't engaged in violence yet. The incipient violent phase is when there are isolated attacks. In some ways, and the manual says this specifically, in some ways, this is the most dangerous and vulnerable phase, because the movement is growing. It's growing behind the scenes. It's organizing. It will occasionally have launch attacks, but the government and citizens view these attacks as isolated events. And so they don't understand the cancer that's growing. And this is a phase when the rebel organizations are sending people abroad for training, for experience. They have infiltrated the military and police forces as a means to get both training and to gather information. So again, it's the building phase, but it's becoming more militarized. And then the open insurgency phase begins when you have a series of consistent attacks against the government and various targets. And so people who study insurgency, one of the premier experts is a guy named David Kilcullen. He's written a bunch of really fantastic books on this subject. He's actually Australian and was an advisor to David Petraeus, and has studied insurgencies his whole life. And he talks, when January 6th occurred, he said, this could actually be a critical event. This could be the start of the open insurgency phase. What will determine that is whether this is the beginning of a consistent set of attacks. And now we know 9 months later, 10 months later, that was not the case. And so Kilcullen would say we are still in stage 2. We are at the incipient stage where you still have these organizations still trying to organize and they haven't launched their series of attacks yet.
What might that look like? Just like in modern American society, we're talking, consistent, real or fake bomb threats at states' capitals. Could you kind of lay out what that might look like?
Yeah. Well, I mean, one of the really interesting things about the far right here in the United States, we know that there's been significant growth in militias in the United States, especially since 2008. We know that most of that growth has been on the far right. We know that about 65% of those militias are white supremacy groups, about 25% are anti-federal government groups. We know that for the most part, they have not been coordinating their activities. They have been kind of operating independently, although Charlottesville in 2017 was the first time that they came together. And then we now have evidence. JJ McNabb is I think she's a journalist who's been following the far right. We now have evidence that they were cooperating prior to January 6th. And so it does appear that there's some of the bigger ones, like the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys and the 3 Percenters, may be interested in forming an alliance. But for the most part, up until now, they have operated relatively independently, and they don't necessarily have the exact same goal. So if you're the Michigan militia, for example, which is both white supremacist, which has white supremacist goals and anti-federal government goals. I can imagine a scenario where that militia gets frustrated with attempts to change the federal government and decides instead that it's going to focus on Michigan. And so the logic there would be, if we can't end immigration, if we can't ensure that America will remain a white Christian country, then we can at least ensure that Michigan remains a white Christian state. And I can imagine a scenario where their strategy to do this is to begin to target African American churches in Detroit, beginning to target minorities and Jews in the urban areas where they generally tend to live, with the goal of convincing them to leave the state. I could see, where there are assassinations of individuals who are sympathetic to the Democrats or to the federal government. The attempted assassination of Governor Whitmer is a perfect example of that. But I could also imagine a scenario where judges are targeted who are not supporting the agenda, the far right agenda. So that would be one example, and you could see variations of that around the country.
Hi there, my name is Matt Brown. I'm with the Washington Post. Could you just talk for a bit about potential regionalism in your analysis of the rise of civil wars? I know the US is a very big and varied country. Oftentimes the populations in certain states are more than the countries that have had civil wars in the past. Can you talk about, for instance, I know that a lot of these things have been going on all across the country, but the likelihood of a civil war-like event happening in a Georgia, Michigan versus Massachusetts or an Idaho. Is that a thing that you think that matters in this analysis, or what's your perspective on that?
I think that's a great question. A lot of people think that if there is a civil war, it will be a secession movement. They think the country's divided. And our last civil war was a war for secession. And if you're thinking about long-term solutions and in a deeply divided country, shouldn't the citizens just split? I don't see this happening for a lot of reasons. The first Civil War was a secessionist movement because all of the Confederate states and the individuals who led those states, who were all white men, white Christian men, and slaveholders, they were in agreement about what they wanted to happen. If they continued to remain part of the United States, slavery would end. This would radically change their quality of life, and they were unwilling to do that. That is just not the case today, where even in the South, you have these major urban areas that are not conservative. You have this big divide between rural areas that vote Republican and urban areas that vote Democrat, and the major population centers would not be in agreement for secession, especially with the purposes of creating a white dominant government. I also know, I've studied secessionist movements. Secessionist movements are the most violent, long-lasting civil wars. They're also the least likely to end in compromise. They tend to be fought to the death. And the reason for that is governments react the same way Lincoln reacted, which is they don't like to give up territory. And they don't like to give up territory because they're afraid if they give away one piece of territory, other people in other parts of the country will also want independence, and eventually there will be no country left to give away. So I don't see these groups gaining enough support and unified support, even in deep red states, to be able to be successful. And I don't see the federal government tolerating secession.
But do you see issues within states? Not so much like if Idaho is going to secede or not, but what question of, like, I live in Atlanta, for instance, and the state that has, as you said, a huge urban-rural divide and a large racial divides, and you can go to any county in the south of the state, and you can find like literally still across the tracks towns. Those types of places where you would have people say that I want you to go back to where you came from, or that there's going to be political issues if identity reemerges as an issue, is not so much like, does the government of Georgia say we're going to secede, but how do you predict if there's problems arising inside of a state like a Georgia versus is New York going to have problems inside of itself?
Oh, I haven't seen scholarship on that. Lots of people are writing are starting to write about what's happening at the very local level. And probably one of the most interesting things that I've been reading about is the power of sheriffs in the United States, and the fact that these are elected officials. They tend to be quite popular in the area, where they are, and many of them are sympathetic to the far right. And so, there's this book written by Stephen Marche about, he went around and interviewed hundreds of people from, law enforcement, in the military, in government, in churches, asking them about, how they thought something might emerge at the very, very local level. It's a really interesting read, but he talks about how critical the critical role that sheriffs play, that when things start to get out of hand, if the sheriff and law enforcement support the insurrectionists, and they have the support of the local population, this is a really, really challenging situation for the federal government, because if the federal government comes in to an area that's hostile to it and it overreaches in any way, so let's say somebody is killed, think about Ruby Ridge or Waco, Texas. This is exactly actually what these far right groups want, because this will help them swell their support and turn the local population against these so-called federal interlopers. So I can't cite scholarship to tell you what it says about the actual local level dynamics that happen, but people are starting to study it, and the role of the sheriff, in my opinion, is going to be critical.
I was wondering if you could talk about in the book, there's this moment where you talk about the woman from Sarajevo and how she didn't realize it before it was too late. Was that something that you found in other places in the world too? And can you kind of talk about that experience? So if you could talk more about what she experienced, and just talk about her experience more, and whether or not you found that experience in other places in the world.
Yeah, so the answer is yes. So I interviewed her. I interviewed other people who lived through the war in Sarajevo, but also in Baghdad, in Kyiv, in Belfast, and they all said the same thing, which is, I didn't see it coming. And sometimes they'll apologize and they'll say, I know that seems ridiculous. But even in retrospect, when I look back, I still, I'm still shocked that war came out, that war happened. And I think part of the reason is just day-to-day life. People are busy. Everybody's busy. People are having kids, raising kids, going to weddings, going to work, getting sick. They don't really have time to pay close attention to the nuances of politics. And of course, the people who are organizing for war in Sarajevo, it was the paramilitary groups that were organizing in the hills above the city. They don't want to be discovered. And if they are discovered, they have a ready-made story to explain why they were there, which of course is fictitious. And then the second reason, I think, is human beings are inherently hopeful. Not only are we busy, but we truly, truly want to believe that tomorrow things are going to be better than today. We don't want to go down the rabbit hole of things are going to get worse. And we certainly don't want to go down the rabbit hole of, things could be horrendous. Nobody wants to think about, the siege of Sarajevo. It's just impossible to get your mind around that. And of course, people who are busy, and then if the leaders of these movements and their supporters can keep people distracted, it gives them the space to organize, and it gives them the element of surprise, which is really, really key. But I really think it's a combination of everybody's busy. So they're paying attention in their day-to-day life, and for the most part, everybody's hopeful. So they don't want to believe that the worst case scenario can happen, and that leaves them unprepared.
Mark Walker with the New York Times. I think we talked about mentioning that we're kind of in stage 2. Are we closer to transitioning to stage 3, or closer to maybe a backslide into stage 1? And what is if we're closer to one of the others, what is sort of the factors or the sort of the missing ingredients?
So the things that so it was really, really critical to whether we were going to, go closer to stage 3 or move back towards stage 1 was how the U.S. government reacted to January 6th. So would the FBI be willing and able to go after the individuals who participated in January 6th? Would they be willing and able to begin to infiltrate these movements? We know, for example, that the height of the last militia movement was in the late 1960s. It peaked just after Timothy McVeigh's bombing in Oklahoma City. And then it declined actually substantially after that, and it didn't reverse again until 2008 with the election of Barack Obama. And the reason why it declined was in part discussed by the American people for what Timothy McVeigh had done. At the time, the Oklahoma City bombing attack of the federal building was considered an isolated event. We now know that McVeigh was part of one of the Michigan militias. We know that he had pages of the Turner Diaries in the backseat of his pickup truck. So he was part of this far right movement. And so the American public in disgust kind of turned against that, and membership in these far right militia groups declined. But more importantly, the FBI was incredibly effective at infiltrating these groups and essentially neutralizing them. And so what those of us who study far-right movements, violent extremist movements, we're all looking to see was what was the U.S. government going to do in response. And what we're seeing is that they're doing all the same things that they did after the Oklahoma City bombing. And my sense is that it's going to make it harder for these groups to operate. The head of the Oath Keepers is likely going to go to prison. Stuart Rhodes, and this is going to be a setback for them. So I would say we're moving closer back to the incipient. We're towards stage 1. We're probably going to stay in the incipient insurgency phase. We're not moving closer to civil war at this point.
This is Sophia with Axios. I wonder what role you see de-radicalization play, and what is your assessment of the federal government's? Because it's, this whole thing of de-radicalizing someone is still in its early stages, but it's not like a widespread sort of, in the way that we address drug addiction.
Right.
It's not a public health issue. It doesn't seem like it's it's a priority, but it's an effective strategy here.
Yeah, the evidence on what causes individuals to become radicalized is still in its early phases, and it's actually turns out it's not that easy to do. If you just look at the internet, the research is now is showing definitively that there is a connection between online extremist propaganda and the radicalization of individuals online. But we actually don't know how exactly that is done. And that means if we are only at the very early stages of understanding what causes radicalization, and at the early stages of understanding how that actually works, putting in a best response, putting in a policy to de-radicalize people is going to be very rudimentary at best. So, that's the big question mark in my mind. When people ask me what's the single easiest thing we can do to tamp down the hatred, the divisiveness, to reduce the risk of civil war, my answer is always, we should regulate social media. And in fact, what we really should be doing is regulating recommendation engines that are pushing the most violent and extreme material into people's hands, and in that way serving to radicalize them. But as long as the big media companies like Facebook refuse to release their data, which is exactly what they're doing, scholars like me and scholars who study this, cannot do the analysis that would allow us to say how exactly this is happening, which actually makes it hard to stop. And of course, the reason why people like Mark Zuckerberg are jealously guarding their data is because their own internal studies have shown, in fact, that their algorithms are leading to higher rates of female teen suicide, are leading to higher rates of societal division, are leading to more hate crimes, and are in fact leading to political violence in certain contexts. And they don't want anybody else. And the reason we know that their internal studies say this is because of whistleblowers from within Facebook who have revealed that to the world. So radicalization is a huge problem. It has certainly accelerated since the dawn of the internet. It accelerated after certain technological, additions to social media, like the like button and the share button, which then allowed tech companies to create algorithms that would drive material that gained more attention into the hands of a greater number of people, and we've seen a whole host of negative societal effects as a result.
Candace Norwood, I'm a reporter with the 19th News. I don't, to preface, I haven't done a ton of reporting on this myself, but I'm curious, especially from the 19th perspective. And I guess I'm curious about kind of gender, the role that gender plays in this, and also whether we're seeing new trends emerge as far as more women, for example, potentially getting involved in these efforts. Is there kind of a recognition or understanding that success might require buy-in from more women, if that makes sense? Yeah, I'm just curious.
So again, the academic scholarship has been very slow to study women. And I think a large part of that has to do with the fact that most academics until recently were men, and it just didn't occur to them to study women. That's changing. And so we're starting to see that women are influential in lots of different contexts. We know, for example, in peace movements, if more women are involved, they tend to be more successful. Erica Chenoweth is a professor at the Kennedy School at Harvard, and she's the world's leading expert on nonviolent protest. And one of her findings was that the greater the percentage of women who are involved in protests, the higher the likelihood of success. We don't know exactly why that's the case. It could be something as simple as soldiers are less apt to shoot at women, but it could be a whole host of other reasons as well. In my book, I don't really talk about women that much because I'm taking existing scholarship and I'm applying it to the United States, and there hasn't been a lot of existing scholarship on on the role of women. But I'll tell you something that I think is related, we actually know who tends to start civil wars. And it's not the most powerful. I mean, it's not the weakest groups. It's not the poorest groups. It's certainly not immigrants. You know, these groups don't have the time, the capacity, the ability to organize and fight the government. And in addition, the government tends to be watching them very carefully. And so even if there was a nascent movement, it's very hard for it to get off the ground. The groups that do tend to start civil wars and to organize and engage in political violence tends to be the groups that had once been politically and socially dominant and are in decline. So they're the ones who are losing power relative to other rising groups around them. And of course, if you think about the United States, the group that had been dominant since the beginning of this country were white Christian men. And they had privileges that were so extensive that they didn't even realize how privileged they were. It just to them was the norm. And those privileges are slowly going away, and it's left them angry and resentful and feeling threatened. And they do have the capacity to organize, oftentimes with law enforcement and the law turning a blind eye to them. So, I mean, if I were then to apply this to women, right now, 60%, I think, a majority of white women have, voted Republican. They have sided in some ways with their race over their gender. But I suspect, I hope this is not true, but I suspect that we're going to increasingly see men turning on women as women's place in society improves and men's place declines, especially white men. I don't know if you guys read David Brooks's article in the New York Times this past weekend, and just stating statistics of who's graduating from university, who's graduating from professional schools. All of the top law editors at every major law school in the United States are women. Women are just succeeding more in school and increasingly in the workforce as the types of jobs change from manufacturing to service jobs. I suspect this has become and will continue to become quite threatening to a certain subset of men who see that their right to the best jobs and the best schools is being taken away, and that you will see an increase in anti-female rhetoric and moves, and I'll go out there and I'll say, I do see the end of Roe v. Wade as probably part of that phenomenon.
That's Mark Walker at the New York Times again. How effective would you say, I guess, the FBI's neutralization of some of these white extremist groups have been? It seems that they will have an incident and then they'll step in and sort of be a deterrence, and then things go quiet. Then the next incident is a significantly higher escalation than the previous. I don't think sort of when we started having some of these incidents in the 90s, anyone foresaw that eventually it would turn into storming the capital of the country. So how effective really is the FBI's neutralization of these groups, and how good of a job is it actually doing sort of breaking up the system, even with sort of the arrest from January 6th? How does that deter from something greater happening when it seems to be that's the trend we're heading down, because there seems to be significantly large admin scale?
I have no answer for that because I have not seen studies on it. I suspect if I were to spend an afternoon digging and seeing what I could find, that there wouldn't be a lot of material. The FBI is not advertising what its strategy is vis-a-vis these groups. It certainly isn't advertising how effective they've been. It's all been very quiet, all very behind the scenes. we'll hear about the big cases with, the Stewart Rhodes of the Oath Keepers who's on trial and likely to go to prison. You'll hear about those cases, but I suspect there's a whole lot of other stuff going on that we just don't know, and it's too early for scholars to be able to get that information to say anything definitively.
Is there any research to show that maybe they've spent more time, I guess, focusing resources on sort of like groups primarily of color than white supremacy groups?
Focusing
Like,
more on which groups?
Like groups like Black Lives Matters.
I'm
like
sorry,
Department of
you
Homeland
cut out
Security.
again. Focusing more on which groups?
Like that maybe like the FBI and like Department of Homeland Security may be focusing too much on groups like Black Lives Matters and sort of missing some of the emergence
Yes.
of other groups. Like
Yeah.
there was, DHS had a
Yes.
internal domestic terrorism list that basically consists of members of Black Lives Matters.
Yes.
And like seemingly like completely missed January 6th. And so
Yes.
are they like maybe misprioritizing their resources?
Well, they were grossly misprioritizing their resources until probably until probably, when did it really? Maybe 2020. Prior to that, there were individuals within the Department of Homeland Security and within the FBI who were online following the chat rooms of far-right groups. They were writing reports about the rapid rise of these groups, about their plans to launch violent attacks. There was a fabulous report done, I think, in 2019 that just outlined the threat, and also indicating how these groups had, certainly had the support of ex-servicemen returning from Iraq and Afghanistan, that they had sympathies within law enforcement in some cases. And the Republican Party first had a huge uproar and squelched those reports. And then actually even the Democrats under Obama eventually refused to, they retracted that report because they found it politically too sensitive. But what that means is it was pissing off white voters who both parties felt were important for them. That information became impossible to ignore as the militias grew and as you had more and more incidences. But even today, I'm sure there's less, that we're being less aggressive than we could be. We had that Washington Post op-ed at the end of last year by 3 retired generals, I think, who said that they really were afraid that if political violence broke out, that the military could split based on loyalties to one side and the other, that they weren't sure that the military would remain loyal to the Constitution. And then more recently, we had a report, who was it? Showing that, the extent to which, law enforcement was sympathetic to, or members of law enforcement were sympathetic to far-right groups, and the problem that this would cause if, in fact, violence broke out at the local level, that it wasn't clear how local law enforcement would respond. And so we are getting these indications that there are political reasons why politicians might not want to really gather information about the extent of this problem, and then that those individuals who are quite loyal to these movements, who are feeding these movements information and allowing these movements to circumvent the law. So no, I think if you're a white man in this country, there's enormous tolerance for bad behavior.
Looking ahead to 2024, what should we keep our eyes open for? What are you bracing for?
Oh, I'm worried no matter who wins in 2024. If a Democrat wins, a majority of the Republican Party and its leadership are going to say that the 2024 election was stolen. And we know that, again, the groups that tend to initiate civil wars are not only these dominant groups in decline, but a trigger is often a loss in a sequence of elections. So when it suddenly becomes crystal clear that that they cannot compete in the existing system, this then leads them to believe that the only way to obtain what they want is through extra systemic means, and oftentimes violent means. So the Republican Party lost the 2020 election. A majority of voters and leadership claim that was because it was stolen. If the Democrats win again, no matter by what margin, that's the narrative and the myth that's going to continue to be spread, and this is going to give fuel to those individuals who feel like working within the system is no longer in their interest, and violence is justified. If the Republicans win, I worry perhaps even more, because I think in the short term, they know that they have to somehow cement in minority rule. They know that they might not get into power again, and therefore their aim is to ensure that the opposition cannot compete effectively moving forward. This is what Trump wanted to do. He stated it publicly, or no, that's since come out in the January 6th committee hearings, that his goal was to stay in power, and then through a variety of means, voter suppression, gerrymandering, a whole series of things, putting loyalists into power in important swing states so that elections were always called for the Republican Party. He was going to set in place those things that would allow the Republicans to stay in power, even if we continue to hold elections. And I think the Republicans are aiming for that strategy because they haven't been able to move away from this white Christian base that's very active and has been key to them winning elections so far. And as long as they can't get away from that base, their numbers are declining. Whites are the demographic in the United States that is losing percentage-wise more than any other group. So in a one person, one vote democratic system, they cannot continue to win. And so I do think they're going to try everything in their power to ensure that the field is no longer an increasingly unlevel. So. And then if the Republicans are successful in essentially creating a system like Orban has created in Hungary, where you have elections, but the opposition cannot effectively compete, and therefore Orban stays in power forever, that means that a majority of Americans will be shut out of political power. It means that our country, which is multi-ethnic, racial, multi-religious, that it will essentially be a country run by white Christians, and eventually this is going to create deep grievances. And the other thing we know is that groups that are excluded from political power over the long term, they also eventually organize.
Barbara, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
It's my pleasure, and good luck with everything you do. Journalists are critical, as you know. The media is critical. We are all in a big fight for our country and our democracy, and you guys will be at the front line. So I wish you all the luck.